It's wonderful to see so many people here tonight. Can you hear me okay? All right. My name is Michelle Dillon, and I'm very pleased to welcome you here tonight on behalf of Rodman Public Library, on behalf of the One Book, One Community Committee, and also on behalf of the Alliance Historical Society. So you might be here in this room because of any one of those three entities who are just gems for our community. We have a wonderful program for you tonight. It's a program on railroad history called Child of Steam, Alliance's Birth at the Crossing. Now, if you're here from the One Book, One Community program, you know that the book this year is The Orphan Train. So it makes a lot of sense that that a presentation on railroad history would fit with a book called The Orphan Train. I wanted to tell you, though, that we have a couple of other programs lined up for the One Book, One Community
Here's a good one.
Oh,
1 week from tonight.
Well, 1 week from tonight, in this very room, at 7 p.m., and I expect all of you to be here next week, I'm going to be doing a presentation on genealogy. Now, unless you've read The Orphan Train and know about the plot of the book, you wouldn't know that it would deal with genealogy. The railroad thing is much easier to come across, but we'll have a program on genealogy, using genealogy to find your family history next Monday, and then the culmination of the One Book Committee is Thursday, March 26th, and that one will be at the Union Avenue United Methodist Church when the author of the book, Christina Baker Klein, will be speaking. So we have those things to look forward to. And I think Rob, our speaker, is probably going to tell you about another program that's coming up possibly in April as a sequel to this one. But let me introduce our speaker. Rob Hyde is just a real a blessing for this community. I'm proud to call him a friend. He is just a wonderful student of history, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy this program this evening. Rob has a bachelor's degree from Mount Union College. He also has a master's degree in marketing from the University of Pittsburgh. He is the past president of a group called the Alliance Area Preservation Society, which some of you may know as the HAHN'S group. He is retired as a director for the Wayne Center for the Arts in Wooster, Ohio. But before that, for 15 years, he worked at the Canton Museum of Art as director of marketing and development. He has lots of other qualifications, such as past president of Ohio Museums Association. He served as a chair for Leave a Legacy Stark County. He served on the City of Alliance's Historic Preservation Commission and also Castle Crusaders Capital Campaign. That's a pretty fine resume, and we are looking forward to a wonderful program. Please help me welcome Rob Hyde.
Thanks so much. Thank you all for being here. I'm here because of Art Murdoch, which Art is, there he is right down there. Okay, I did a program for the continuing learning program at Mount Union about 2 years ago now, and afterwards he was like, hey, do you know anything about the railroads and Alliance? And I was like, well, there's big thoughts, you know, down at the end of Main Street. And I actually wasn't able to name the two original train companies that did it. Anyway, he was like, well, I've asked a bunch of people, and no one's really had a program that they could do on trains. And he was like, would you be willing to do that? And I was like, thought about it for a minute, thought, well, yeah, this is Alliance. I mean, it's here because of trains. And so somebody ought to spend some time looking into it. And so I took him up on that, and he gave me a year. And I actually started well in advance of my usual timetable, which is about a week and a half before the program. And found lots of interesting stuff. Fortunately, for me, I'm in a terrific environment in order to research stuff. And I tip my hat back to Michelle and to Karen Perrone here at the library and the whole staff here at the library does a great job in archiving and maintaining lots of great information about the history of our community and the work of the Historical Society. And this is both a explanation and an apology. In that one of the great things about researching a little bit about railroads is that there's a lot of stuff about railroads, okay? And there are lots of people that are interested in it, and I am not a rail fan, I am not a rail historian particularly. I've been more interested in local history, and there's some people that know a heck of a lot more about how trains operate and what they've done through the years, and there are folks that have specific interest in specific railroads, and then there's a whole category of model railroad and toy train and the rail fans that are here at the foot of Main Street daily almost to watch the trains go by. And they're all doing really interesting stuff, and so there are a lot of people that know a lot more than I do. But I had a good time looking at stuff about Alliance, why we're here, and this program, Child of Steam, it comes from Levi Lamborn, used it in his Lamborn history of Lexington, or his history of Lexington Township. Available for sale at the desk at the back of the room. This describing Alliance as a child of steam. And so, let's talk about this. And this program, we kind of about the first 20 or 30 years or so. And so, let's get started with this thing now. Yeah, there we go. That's the one. And because we're talking about birth, okay, so you have conception at some point, right? And actually, to kind of with that in mind, we're going to start with kind of the environment that we were in here, and starting in the 20s here in Ohio, the 1820s. Ohio had been a state for over 20 years by then. It was already being settled in a big way, and the wealth, the richness of the natural resources here, the great farmland was already reaping benefits, both for individual farmers looking for subsistence living, but also, and folks interested in going to market. And so there were ways that they wanted to find to get the resources that are here out, which at that time was the West, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan, was the old Northwest Territory, right? And they wanted to find ways to get our goods back east, and the folks back east wanted to bring the stuff towards them. And so it kind of helped launch an explosion of transportation. So here, Ohio really was the land of milk and honey, and actually as we move our way closer into northeast Ohio, and actually if you look here, we're there in the middle someplace. There's Stark County, and let's look for all of the towns and cities. Oh, well, there's Canton, and there's, well, they're out here someplace. Yes, we're in the wilderness pretty much at that point. But there is a road that runs between Deerfield and Canton at the time. And actually, transportation is building up in a big way. And it's happening in three major ways at first. The natural waterways of the Ohio River, Lake Erie. In the teens, steamships were starting to run on the rivers, so that was bringing goods back and forth more quickly. They started building the National Road from Washington, D.C. area toward Cumberland Gap and all the way over to Wheeling, and started working it over that way so that there was at least a overland route, something more than the basic trails. And then the big eye-opener were canals, which were already advanced in the eastern part, but here in the west we're just beginning. And the big game changer in that was the Erie Canal up in New York, which opened a fairly direct lane from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Erie. But there was also another thing on the horizon, and that was railroads that started to appear about 1830. And here are some of the earliest trains. The Baltimore and Ohio was the first railroad company that started to head towards the west. And actually, that's an engine known as the Tom Thumb. Early on, it had to be able to race a horse in order to justify why they wanted steam engines instead of horses pulling the trains. The first major train, which went between two cities, Charleston and a city that's totally escaping my mind right now, is this, the engine called the Friend of Charleston, and this one is called the John Bull, which was an engine that started running in New Jersey, and it was actually imported from Britain. They discovered that engines that worked in Britain didn't work very well in the terrain of the United States. So they were early experiments, but early successes in the East. And so by the middle 1830s, folks were interested in bringing railroads out west. And there's the United States as it stood in the middle 1830s. As we go in a little bit tighter, okay, there were essentially three major eastern seaboard ports that were looking to bring the goods from the west. They were New York City, which had just changed the game. Philadelphia had for the longest time been the biggest city, the biggest port, but once the Erie Canal opened up here and was bringing Erie Canal down the Hudson River, New York, they were starting to get all the business. The guy in third place that got the city in third place, Baltimore. All three of them were interested in getting to the west, and at the time, getting as further west possible was St. Louis over here. And so, beginning in the 1830s, there were a number of ways that both the eastern interests and all of the states in between were trying to find ways to create east and west routes, okay? And there were literally hundreds of new charters for new railroads pulled out every year, except that only a handful of them got started. And actually, by the time, later part of in that time, Salem, Ohio, was kind of the largest settlement in this specific area. Actually, Columbiana County in 1830 was the third largest county in the state of Ohio after Hamilton and Washington counties. That's Marietta and Cincinnati along the river, right? And the players there in Salem were looking to start and promote a railroad that would be the Great Western Railroad, okay? Coming through the wheatlands of Ohio and coming through Salem, Ohio. Zadok Street, Samuel Chessman, both businessmen, dry goods folks. Zadok Street was the grandson of the guy that founded Salem in the first place. They talked the local attorney, a guy named Joseph J. Brooks, known as J.J. Brooks, to help them work with the state legislature and try to get a charter for a new railroad. The downside of all of this was that 1839 rolled around, and I won't belabor my knowledge of 19th century economic depressions, but the panic of 1839 was a devastating depression that lasted for the better part of the next 7-8 years, and so made investment difficult. It stopped the growth of railroads almost dead in its tracks right then. But everyone continued to be interested in the possibilities there. And so, well, we have the conception, we want railroads, but let's see if we can't make it happen. By the mid-1830s, there was another player in the game at this point, and that was what had been the village of Chicago. And in 1832, it had been a town of 350 people, just a little tiny place. But by 1840, it had 4,000, and it was well on its way. By 1850, it would have 29,000. And so the game was changing again, and where, we were looking at this in the middle part of the 1830s, everyone wanted to go west to St. Louis. By the mid-1840s, it had moved. Everyone wanted to get to Chicago because they were already developing all of the agriculture was out here and was working its way into Chicago in order to be shipped via Great Lakes to the east. Also, if we notice real quick, this is where the amazing special effects that I have for you today, right? We're like, back here, right, when everyone was going to St. Louis, if you were in Northeast Ohio, you weren't in the game. Okay, if you're going up, and amazing special effects, okay. And if we go, all of a sudden, Northeast Ohio is right in the middle of all of the action there, and that's what came into play at that point. And actually, we told about the folks in Salem who came up with an idea for their Great Western Railroad. Well, they at least came up with a map that had a line across it that said, okay, it's going to come from Pittsburgh and go across through this way and then go over to Massillon. Massillon was a great place to go because we talked about canals. I didn't mention the Ohio and Erie Canal, which was by the 1830s was in operation. So Massillon was a great grain port at that point. They wanted an east-west train route to go through Massillon, work its way to Worcester, work its way over further west across the state. There was also the play of Cleveland to Wellsville. Wellsville on the Ohio River, made for easy transport via steamship back to Pittsburgh. So that was a really great way to make the rail connection, a quicker way to make the rail connection to Pittsburgh via Wellsville. And so there were two competing concepts, what was known as the Cleveland and Pittsburgh, or the Cleveland and Wellsville Railroad, or that way, and then what they had called like the Great Western Railroad. And it came in different shapes and size forms like that. So, again, we go back to the fine folks of Salem, Ohio. And by this time, J.J. Brooks had been in this game for a while, and so it was actually kind of a guy who was a focal point for organizing their efforts for a railroad that was going to come through Salem. Oh, and this guy too, okay, it was kind of interesting. This guy's name is Simeon Jennings. And it's probably unfair to start telling you somebody's story by reading their obituary, but I think this enlightens us. He was really the money man for Salem and actually for Wellsville as well. And the quick take on this is I pull from his obituary that says, he was noted for his extreme religiousness and intense devotion to money getting. It went further. He always managed somehow to avoid paying a large share of the taxes justly due. Okay, he was the money guy, Simeon Jennings. And so he was part of the mix as well. Their initial effort was to work with the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad Company, which also had firm supporters in three major cities there. The actual founding guy, a guy named Cyrus Prentice in Ravenna, Selah Chamberlain in Cleveland, and it's John McIntosh, right? Yes. In Wellsville. And Cyrus and John are kind of fuzzed out because that isn't really them. Their images have been lost to the annals of time, at least so far. I haven't found the picture. I keep looking for stuff. I keep finding stuff, and that's been one of the fun things about this. So they were very well advanced by the middle part of the 1830s or 1840s in launching an actual railroad. And so they employed the most amazing men of the early part of the 19th century, as far as I'm concerned. Okay, civil engineers. Okay, and it's one of those things that after you read for a while, you kind of go, how is it even possible? You're talking about a technology that required people to construct things that would meet within inches of each other, going tens and hundreds of miles through the wilderness. And they did it with like compasses and sights and chains, and they made railroads. And they made America by the process of doing that. So it is absolutely true. Politicians and money made railroads go. But they wouldn't have happened if it weren't for the engineers in this thing. And so, Dad, when you think I should have been an engineer, it only took me till about 61 before I said, man, maybe I should have done that. Okay. They're pretty amazing guys. There's no two ways about it. And so they were busy trying to find the right route that was going to make everybody happy to go from Cleveland to Ravenna to Salem to Wellsville. And, well, they didn't quite find it because of this. HAHN'S Run, beautiful HAHN'S Run. Who can tell me where HAHN'S Run is? That's right down the road here. It's, well, it's the middle branch. We now know it as the middle branch of Sandy Creek. Okay, it's what runs down. If you look at these pictures, it's cheap because okay, you see, there's this railroad track right there. runs through Homeworth, down through Moultrie, down to Bayeux, right? Okay, but that was known as HAHN'S Run, and there's a HAHN'S farm down there still. I mean, there's still HAHN family down there. But I was looking at this stuff for almost 9, 10 months a year before I came across something that matched up what we know as Sandy Creek with HAHN'S Run, which was lower, broader, longer than any route that went a little further east. Beautiful HAHN'S Run. And the Salem route that those engineers had found, well, it would also require building 2 tunnels and go about 1.5 miles longer. And one of those tunnels was going to be a whole mile long. And the HAHN'S Run route they came up with, well, saved $75,000 to $90,000 in construction costs. And so when the board of the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad, which 12 members, 2 of whom were Zadok Street and Samuel Chessman, voted to which route they were taking, they favored the HAHN'S Run route to bypass Salem 10-2. And Samuel and Zadok Street, they took their board position and their money and left the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad behind. Fortunately, JJ had been working with some folks in Pittsburgh already on that Great Western Railroad concept, because the folks in Pittsburgh were in the process of getting ready to welcome what would soon become the Pennsylvania Central Railroad. It already had a connection that was a combination canal and railroad that came over the mountains. They were going to build a complete railroad from Philadelphia to Pittsburgh. They were looking to go further west from Pittsburgh. And Joseph Brooks put together the Ohio Dream Team, if you will, of folks from Salem, folks from Canton, Worcester, Massillon, and some names that you may or may not recognize. John Larwill, I know from my Worcester time. There's a street named after him. He was one of the first settlers there in town. And Charles Russell was Russell and Company, which was one of the early major manufacturers over in Massillon. The names Harris and Belden still carry some weight over there in Canton, Ohio. The name you least recognize, David Carter, is probably the most powerful of all. He he's listed in Massillon there. He also worked in Akron and Canton from time with Abraham Lincoln, and was eventually at the end of the Civil War nominated by Lincoln to the the First District Court of Appeals, the bench just before the Supreme Court. So he was a very powerful political player as well. And these were the kind of folks that could back up some political might and some money in Ohio and manage to talk the folks that were talking about doing a railroad out of Pittsburgh, that these were the people to work with. Now, what makes a railroad run? Yeah, we sort of mentioned this already. And so it was highly dependent upon finding support in the ways of dollars and cents. Now, a critical part was the ability to sell bonds for construction, but also to find money from local investors. And so those local folks of power got together with their friends in each town, and they did subscriptions for stock, and you could buy a subscription for $50 or $100 of stock and do it in installment paid, so that not only the most prosperous in the community, but some of the lesser investors could start small and take an interest in the future of railroads. And railroads was a mania in the 1840s, actually from about the 1830s through the rest of the 19th century. And the other way was finding government support for those bonds for railroad companies as well. And through the latter part of the 1840s, they were looking for money for what became the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad. And in Stark County, this is kind of enlightening in some ways, I think, does it part. In 1849, they were going to purchase $75,000 worth of the county would or bonds, but they had to get the approval of the voters. And we know about levies and stuff like that these days, right? And a kind of interesting fact here, okay, is that when the vote came up, it passed by a significant number, almost 3,000 to 1,200 votes in favor. However, if we look at our area of Stark County and start with Lexington, well, there was 44 for and 166 against. Marlboro, well, they didn't have any numbers, and actually they never found the votes for the And in Washington Township, it was 37 to 110 against. It would seem that, you know, the folks out in the country, they weren't so happy about railroads going through their farms. But, you know, what was it, like a walking path or bike trail? I really like my So, it's happening, okay? We're finding the money. It's going to happen. And what would I tell you about this? The 1847 rolls around, and there's a panic of 1847 that the Brits caused this time, okay? Because they were over investing and speculating, so it became hard to sell bonds. The upside for railroads in Ohio was that the other thing that happened in Britain was in 1846, they repealed the Corn Laws. You go, why, of course, they repealed the Corn Laws, so that made a difference. Okay. I'll try this. You've heard of the potato famine, okay? Along with the potato famine was general crop failures throughout Europe, 1845, 1846. Britain had for years prohibited the import of grains from the United States. 1846, they said, okay, we'll open it. So, while getting bond level financing was difficult, you could now market grains from the United States to Great Britain. So, if you could build a railroad in Ohio, you could make some money. So, away we go.
But it's not that corn.
What?
Not that corn.
Not that corn. But it looks like corn, right?
No, no. In Britain, corn is wheat.
Well, and
Rye.
you are
They
correct.
don't even know
And the major export out of this part of Ohio was wheat. So it was there was a
They
real
call
market
it
there for
corn.
it.
They call it corn.
Absolutely, and I apologize.
That's all right.
So here we are. We're ready to build a railroad. That Great Western Railroad is now known as the Ohio and Pennsylvania. And I missed a story in there when I was talking about J.J. Brooks and his first starting. There was a gentleman called General William Robinson. His picture was up there on the screen, and I'm not going to go back to it now because okay, we're not going to go back to it. Amazing guy. Okay, he was the first white child born in the Pittsburgh area. Okay, and by the 1840s he was a senior statesman. He was the mayor of Allegheny City, which was the north side of Pittsburgh. Was a separate city that was on across the Allegheny from the city of Pittsburgh, and had great connections. And we'll talk about General Robinson here again in a minute or two. He hired a really smart guy by the name of Solomon Roberts as the chief engineer for the Ohio and Pennsylvania. He had a great resume coming in. He had worked with his uncle to help build the Malt Chalk Railroad, which was the first operational coal railroad in the United States. He worked on that main line of public works, the canal and inclined plane railroad that first crossed the state. He was the president of Railroads and Canals in eastern Pennsylvania in the 1840s, and he became the chief engineer of the O&P in September of 1848, and also became a member of the Pennsylvania legislature that year. And he was a pretty amazing guy, a good-looking guy. He could be a movie star. Apparently, he was also an amazing speaker, and obviously a pretty smart, intelligent engineer guy. And he's got an interesting story. So by 1849, they're ready to break ground. And so they broke ground at the Pennsylvania and Ohio state line. And speaking of being a great speaker, well, at least the great words. I really enjoy the words of the folks that wrote and spoke in the 19th century. So I have some to share with you. And this is Solomon Roberts. who said on July 4th, 1849, "We are assembled on this day at the ceremony of breaking ground to celebrate the commencement of the construction of the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad. This is the birthday of that great work in which we feel so deep an interest. On July 4th, 1776, the great American locomotive Liberty was started in the city of Philadelphia. Its trumpet tones have since sounded through the nations of the earth, and as a cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night, it has become the beacon by which they are endeavoring to shape their course. We stand today on the boundary line of Ohio and Pennsylvania, the two states which have given us a charter to construct a railroad to bind them forever in a more perfect union. The line on which we are now standing divides the old states from the new, but no man could tell this fact from anything he could see around him. The importance of constructing the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad is to unite by the best kind of connection the first agricultural state with the first manufacturing state of the Union, and commends itself to the common sense of every man. Such a road, properly constructed and well managed, must be highly profitable to the stockholders, as well as vastly beneficial to the community. Thus, as time and expense are the measure of distance, our railroads are a most powerful means of drawing together our whole population in bonds of brotherhood. Let us do what we can, both by example and precept, to aid the construction and prompt completion of this great national highway. The man has a way with words. I kind of love this guy. You research stuff. There are certain things that you draw into, and this guy has a great resume and does some amazing things. And at least one other fun fact that I've got for you in a few minutes. So, as the chief engineer, he does the first survey of the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad, and if we look at it, well, it's working its way across the state. I get it here a little tighter, and we see, hopefully, see too, that it's coming up from Pittsburgh, Allegheny City, sorry. It doesn't cross the Ohio River. It goes a little further and crosses the Beaver River. It's an easier crossing. Comes to Salem, and then heads west and goes through, what's that? Mount Union. My goodness. It is. It goes through Mount Union and then heads on to onto Canton and Massillon and Worcester. And that's the first pass in the fall of 1849 of the engineering of the railroad. Well, okay. They got more specific about this civil engineering over between then and March of 1850. And these are the plans that they actually built against. And there's Ohio, and this is that. Looks very familiar, but you look a little closer. Okay, we're still close. And now, as we work our way, and it's going from Salem to this place here, which is now called Alliance. And works its way across to Canton, Massillon, Worcester, Mansfield, and a place that was out in the wheat fields, or is it cornfield, of western Ohio, is now known as Crestline. And that's the end point, because it caught up there with the railroad that was known as the Cleveland, Columbus, and Cincinnati. And so it was the place that they wanted to get to with their Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad. So let's do a little scoring here, okay? This is the how did we get here scoreboard, right? And so, did we get here through political prowess? No. Did we get here through financial might? No. And this is what did we get there through popular support? No, we know particularly not in Lexington, Washington, and Township. No. Did we get there through the sweet benevolence of geography? Absolutely, positively. And in the words of the great 19th century philosopher Mongo.
Mongo only pawn. Game of life.
That's right, Mongo only pawn in Game of Life. And so I thought about calling this Alliance, only a pawn in the game of life. We're here because HAHN'S Run came north and south, and east and west division was between the watershed of Sandy Creek that went to the south and the Mahoney River that went to the north. But there's one other question that we want to have related to all of this: who named Alliance? And this is where I come back to my good friend Solomon Roberts. Now, popular story is one of two stories, right? Williamsport, freedom, liberty came together in an alliance to make alliance. Or, ultimately, we've also heard that General William Robinson, the president of the railroad company, looked at his map where the things would cross and said, boom, alliance. Well, let me reintroduce you to the guy that drew the map that's there on alliance, and again reference his obituary, but this is the first piece of factual printing that I've discovered from the 19th century that says anything on this matter. And it says that in 1848, he became the chief engineer of the Ohio and Pennsylvania and located the line not only to the state line, but beyond as far as Crestline, Ohio, the site of that town, and Alliance, being by him selected and named. So, now I don't really want to discount our two current theories, because actually one is pretty closely related, because in reading about the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad, anytime they launched a new project and they had a meeting with politicians and a dinner and all that stuff, the president of the railroad, General William Robinson, would get up and welcome everybody and then go, and now I introduce Solomon Roberts, who will speak to you for the next 40 minutes in a lot better way than I can, basically. And so I don't doubt that maybe Solomon at the time said, yes, and General Robinson named that. But also at some point he made sure that in his obituary it was noted that he named those towns. So we'll toss that one into the mix. Now, so we have to place an alliance, but the fine folks of Salem came to play in this operation as well. And so if we take a look at a map, this is the right after 1850. If you look at some of the names here, particularly right here by where the crossing is, look who happens to own all of the land right around the crossing. Jennings and Brooks. And well, there's Simeon Jennings up there, and J.J. Brooks down here in Mount Union. And so they came to do business as well. Actually, if we go deeper, and if we think about that early survey that went south, just south of Mount Union, there's a whole strip of land south of Mount Union that has Simeon Jennings' name on it as well. But let's not discount the fact that opportunity knocks for pawns as well. Okay, and so our founder stories also play a role in this. They saw an opportunity, and so the folks that we've known as some of our founding fathers, Matthias Hester, Alicia Teeters, both were already property owners in town and bought more property and helped put out the plats for the area that became the center of Alliance right from then. And so the building was underway, and the first tracks were coming down from the north from on the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad and came through town, and the first engine to appear in what was initially Freedom was called the Ravenna, and it looked just like this, even though this is not a picture of the Ravenna. It's actually a sister vessel, if you will. And one of the great things about the early locomotives is they all had names instead of just numbers. Well, they had names and numbers in some cases, and eventually they just went with numbers. But I'd like somebody else to tell this story here. And this is a guy named W.H. Robinson, who would be an engineer on the Cleveland and Pittsburgh Railroad. But he was born in Utica, New York in 1845, and he moved to Cleveland with his family via the Erie Canal and the Lake Erie in 1847. And then he wrote that sometime around 1845, we moved by wagon to Freedom, now Alliance, Ohio. I can remember my parents talking about a railroad, and in 1850-51, men and teams were grading through our town. the boys would all hunt for Indian arrowheads on the new grade. The first engine I remember of seeing was about 1851, and a number of us boys were hanging on a rail fence watching engine number 1, called Ravenna, laying track, run by engineer M. Albee. While we were watching, the engineer pulled his rope and gave one big blast of the whistle, and we boys all fell off the fence in a big pile on the ground. He also goes on to note that same engine, he ran that same engine starting in 1866, and it was still in service in 1882. He goes on to say that in the summer of 1851, the CNP was completed and trains running into freedom. The first passenger station was just past the curve. There's a little curve. They don't mind on me. Little curve right there. So passenger station was there, located there, and I can pull out that Mr. Samuel Schaefer kept a country store, and he built a platform along the side of the track in front of his store for passengers and freight. It was called Schaefer's Corners. And then a tank house and a long tool shed were built at the siding on the north end of the switch, equipped with 2 one-man pumps. My father, George Robinson, was appointed chief pumper with 1 assistant. I often helped work the pumps. Also piled wood and shifted sand when not at school. And in the fall of 1862, I commenced wiping engines at 75 cents per day. And in May of 1863, I commenced firing for engineer John Grafton on engine number 17, named New Philadelphia. And on May 15th of 1864, I was promoted and commenced running extras and switchers at $2.50 a day as an engineer. He has a really interesting story. There is a picture of the Schaefer building as it was when it last stood around here. And this is sometime in the 50s, I believe, okay, 1950s. And then here's a picture of William and his wife, Martha. He was an engineer on the CNP for almost 25 years. He went into private business for a while, but the railroad bug bit him, and he was an engineer then for the Atchison Beacon Santa Fe for a bunch of years as well, but then came back and settled in Cleveland. Now, by September of 1851, trains were running between Freedom, Alliance, and Cleveland, and actually the flame dealer that September noted in an article that there were 250 people from Stark County, Limaville, and Alliance, and darn if we have rarely seen a body of better looking, more intelligent, and happier people than these Stark County. Twice the number would have come. He said, well, okay, we're glad that they were glad to see us in Cleveland. Hopefully they'll be glad to see us in Pittsburgh as well. Well, and at the same time, the Ohio and Pennsylvania Railroad was building fast, and they opened their first section between Pittsburgh and Beaver. They had a big celebration in Beaver. General Robinson said, and now let me introduce Solomon Roberts, who spoke for an hour, and enthralled everyone in the process. And so the rails were rolling from Pittsburgh. Also, they began running the rails from Alliance, working both east and west at that point, because they could get all that material up over the canals, and then Cleveland and Pittsburgh down south. And they also put their first locomotive from the east here in town, which was known as the Beaver. And this is, in fact, actually a picture of the first locomotive that ran with the Ohio and Pennsylvania here in Alliance. And that was one of those things that it was about a year after I'd started looking for it that it suddenly appeared in a book that it was. And it was also, there's this kind of neat thing in that we can see that this is one of the few examples of this locomotive that exists. It's actually down in Chile, and it was manufactured at the same time as that Beaver, but opened the first railroad that was open in South America, and it was saved back then, and it's still sitting down in Comapian, in Chile. So we're making progress. Pittsburgh to Beaver. We've got the next big break here is Alliance to Salem. And on November 27th, in 1851, the railroad opened in Alliance and went to Salem, and there was a big, big celebration. And depending upon which account, there was either a big dinner in Salem or a big dinner in Alliance. Two different newspapers. One has it in Salem, one has it in Alliance, but all the details are pretty much the same. General Robinson introduces Solomon Roberts. He talks for 45 minutes about the greatness of the railroads. But in this case, there was also great festivities, and it says that the cars ran all day back and forth between Alliance and Salem, and in many cases was loaded with quite a number of the female persuasion. So everyone was taking a chance to do that. So now we have Birth the Railroad, and we're into childhood, and so basically at this point, the construction keeps rolling, and there are a couple of big things that are going to happen fairly quickly here within a week. They extended it to Palestine, right? And then on January 6, 1852, it's coming all the way from Pittsburgh to Alliance, and so a connection, the first rail connection between Pittsburgh and Cleveland is established. It's an amazing breakthrough that is followed just a few weeks later, a month and a half later, opening to Massillon. It was 91 miles from Pittsburgh to Massillon. There were 91 riflemen sitting on the hill of the train coming into Massillon, and as it came into Massillon, they said a 91 gun salute. And they had a big dinner, and General Robinson introduced Solomon Roberts, and they talked all night. Okay. Over the course of the next year and a half, almost, extended to Worcester by the summertime, and then next April, out to Crestline. And this was a wildly successful railroad venture. By June of 1852, the first Union Depot was built here. It's on the north side of the tracks from where we have the station now and where the big station, what we know as Sauerbeck House. And this is the picture that I knew for a long time. And I came across this one too, which then I presented to Karen and said, I've never seen this before. She says, we have it in the library. It's actually not the same picture. This one actually was done, it's been in the Alliance room for a while. It was done by F.A. Hoyles, okay? And so actually this one that I came across from, by the way, a descendant of a book someplace, he still hasn't told me which book it was, but I have that picture. And so apparently this is the picture that F.A. Hoyles used to do that thing there. That's pretty cool. Anyway, the first Union Depot. And of course, we can't talk about the Union Depot in Alliance without talking about Daniel and Eliza Sauerbeck. Coming up with Eliza Sauerbeck's name was difficult. Everything I read for the first year or so always said, and Mrs. Sauerbeck. Unfortunately, Ancestry.com and stuff overcome some of those problems and I was able to identify. But Daniel Sauerbeck, his father was a hotelier in Pennsylvania, and actually he became a bit of an adventurer, Daniel did, and did some surveying, some engineering work, but also was a horseman, and so was also in a couple of cavalry militia kind of groups, but eventually wound up in Brighton where he opened the Sauerbeck House, his first business, and that was in 1849, or 1848, and had some success there. I think perhaps he had some success with some of those parties that they had with the OMP, because they were invited to operate the hotel in the new depot in Alliance. He already had a great reputation, and he helped make Alliance's reputation, and established an eating house. Okay, so what's an eating house? Well, actually, it was kind of a general name for a restaurant, but railroad eating houses were a thing, and they were a thing that you tried to avoid at all costs, except that if you wanted to eat, and you were traveling for hours and hours and hours, and they stopped for 20 minutes in order to feed you, you got out and got fed. And they were notoriously awful. Well, this was a place that was not notoriously awful, and I will read a quick excerpt here. The reputation of the Sauerbeck House in Alliance, Ohio, is universal among railroad travelers as the best place to get a meal anywhere in this great and glorious country. It goes on and on like that. And if you've read any of the stuff about Sauerbeck's, it's always how wonderful it was. And, you know, Michelle mentioned I have a master's in marketing, so marketing, he goes, Daniel, were you, sending changing letters and then different names, different editors. It's all, and actually researching now, it's where you don't expect to see it. And one of the best examples I had was I was reading something about a conductor on the Ohio and Pennsylvania became the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, Chicago Railroad, doing a speed run from Pittsburgh to Chicago, okay? And mostly this is all about, they only stopped once to change locomotives, they didn't stop for anything, but for some reason, when they went through Alliance, he had to mention, and that's where Daniel Sauerbeck has that wonderful house. I mean, he had no reason because he was talking about how fast the train was going, how they weren't stopping, but boy, it was good food at Sauerbeck House. So I tend to think that there is some validity to the stories that go along with that as well. So, racing west. Okay, the idea was to head to Chicago. Okay, but it's kind of hard and kind of expensive, and finances were difficult in the 1850s as they were in the 1830s and 1840s. And by 1856, a plan came together in order to finish the railroad between Pittsburgh and Chicago, which created from 3 other railroads, the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad, with significant help from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. I only mention that now because when we get to part 2, at some point, we're going to talk a lot about the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. This is where it starts. The other big thing that happened with this was the first time that Alliance was promised that they would have a division headquarters. And by 1859, that railroad was complete. And now, Chicago is a huge city. It goes from, we had it at 29,000 in 1850. It went to over 100,000 by 1860. So you can't even conceive of that. So, some additional stuff that happened around here. A night to remember, December 8th, 1856, is probably the worst accident that happened here in Alliance, at least as far as deaths go. There's a bigger accident that happens another 123 years later, but we're not going to talk about that right now. Again, special effects and graphics. Okay, there's the depot on the north side of the tracks at the crossing. We have coming in the Ohio and Pennsylvania coming in there for its regular stop at 6:30, stopping for 20 minutes in order for people to have their dinner at the wonderful Daniel Sauerbeck House. It's cold that night. It's just below freezing. There's a light snow. There's a little bit of ice on the tracks. The Cleveland and Pittsburgh comes up from the south and will cross the crossing at 7 o'clock. But the Ohio and Pennsylvania is due to leave at 10 till. Plenty of time, right? And so as it appears. So at a little later than 10 till, apparently, the Ohio and Pennsylvania starts across the track, and unfortunately, fairly quick order. Sound effects too. There is a crash, and what happens is that the back 2 cars from the Ohio and Pennsylvania come off the track, and the very last one runs into the depot there. That's where the octagon area there. And there are 8 people killed in there. There's 1 person on the tracks who had been one of the railroad employees that tried to flag down the Cleveland and Pittsburgh. And it was the largest accident there. And it was breaking news. And as we've come to expect from news organizations, dealt with in a very discreet nature, and with no sensationalism. Okay, well, it was. But in fact, there were 8 people who died, another 15 that were injured. Among them were a new doctor in town who just moved there with his new wife from Salem. They built a house, and they were both killed that day. And also a young man who came in from New Jersey to marry a girl who was in Limaville. His prospective father-in-law had come to meet him, and he was killed in that accident as well. So it was a real tragedy. And actually, it is the first, then the result of that was that then that summer, the legislature passed the first, that summer the legislature passed the first legislation that required every train coming to a crossing to come to a complete stop. It wasn't even a law then. Okay, so we're moving along here. We're coming up on the looming Civil War, and Abraham Lincoln eats salt. Abraham Lincoln, elected in November of 1860, he was contacted by the president of the Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago Railroad to suggest that he had the perfect way for the president-elect to make it to Washington, to come across on his railroad. Well, actually, as it turned out, he went on a kind of more roundabout way that took him all the way over to Pittsburgh, and then came back out south, and it came through Alliance, and up to Cleveland, and up to Buffalo, and over to Albany, and down to New York, and eventually he made it to, it was a whistle-stop tour in advance of his inauguration. And so Alliance put out a great welcoming, including the HAHN'S Cornet Band, the three HAHN'S brothers of the HAHN'S house, okay. They actually, after the war, became the Alliance City Band. And so they played when the president came. And the train didn't stop as a mere dinner stop. It stopped at the request of the Alliance Committee. A gentleman named E. Crew, okay, he was actually a photographer, and actually you'll find some old pictures from Alliance that have his imprint on them. So he was a successful photographer here, but he was also the chairman of the committee for Lincoln. Invited him to come through Alliance and stop when he came here. So he came at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and according to the Salem Republican newspaper, many folks from Salem and then from Canton traveled down to the station. There were over 1,000 people in attendance, and they were all there about a half hour, safe and sound in what he called the City of Mud. Okay, Salem and Alliance, and it's always going to kind of be that way, I suppose. But it was also February, and so, man, if you had a bunch of dirt streets, and you would have a city of mud. There's no two ways about it. Well, he arrived at 2, to great cheers from 1,000 people. He told the people that he understood that there was a turkey prepared for him to discuss. But that after attending to that important matter, he would come back and address a few words. And so after his quick lunch, because he did keep it to about 20 minutes, he came back out, and he said he would gave the famed Alliance address, which you're not supposed to read stuff. I'm supposed to. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I appear before you merely to greet you and say farewell. I have no time for long speeches. I could not make them at every stopping place without wearing myself out. If I should make a speech at every town, I would not get to Washington until sometime after the inauguration. But as I am somewhat interested in the inauguration, I would like to get there a few days before the 4th of March. This apparently is the address that he made at every small town stop between Springfield and Washington, D.C., with one exception. The last line was never used in any other location. So, Alliance, Ohio, we got 4 sentences. Still, an amazing moment for the community. And there's one other little note, a fun fact, as they say. The legend of Amos Ailes, a student at Mount Union at the time. He was apparently a very tall young gentleman, and either on his way in or way out ran into Mr. Lincoln and said, I believe I'm as tall as, maybe taller than you are. And according to the story, Abraham Lincoln looked in and said, sir, I believe I could eat salt off the top of your hat. Now, why you would want to, I don't know. But also, Amos Ailes went on to a career with the railroads here in Alliance, was a supervisor in the roundhouse for 40 years. And I'll tell you, if I was working at the railroad station for 40 years, I would be telling that story to every person that came along. So there's a reason why those stories last for a long time. The Civil War came, railroads revolutionized war. War transformed railroads, okay? Men, material, and stuff moved fast. But because they had to move fast, railroads had to be more organized. They became more efficient, both from a war-making standpoint, but also for a stuff-delivering standpoint. It was a sea change for them. Here in Alliance, the railroads were important because it was a key mustering point for troops in both initial enlistment, which was just a few months, and then for the longer 3-year enlistment at a place called Camp Ford, which is, this is Ely down here, and Vine up here, and Union right there. So, here's where Camp Ford is, and that was an important mustering spot. And also, during the Civil War, was an opportunity for the community. Business was good for the community, for the railroad, and for Alliance, and that headquarters arrived in Alliance as well, including the Roundhouse. And also during this time was the tragic Depot fire, which I recreated with Photoshop, but did lead to the building of what we know as the Sauerbeck House for $75,000 and opened in 1866. To great acclaim, the railroad advertised their wonderful eating houses, including Alliance, Ohio. And as I said, the war was good for the community, and so big changes were happening immediately after the war, including this one, the Peters-Lamborn edition. Again, you see here's the crossroads, and look at where all of these 990 lots are all around the area that was not previously developed, but was where Alliance was going to grow. Brought to you by Alicia Teeters, Levi Lamborn, also Huey Blakey. And centerpiece in that was the brand new Alliance College, okay, which opened in 1868. This building, it was not wildly successful. We actually know this building as then the first Alliance High School, because by 1873, the college was defunct. This building, which was the dormitory was immediately behind it and was the first St. Joseph School. Okay. And so this was a time of peace and prosperity for Alliance, and we're winding up the program now, okay? Making that day, May 10, 1869, one that we kind of marked last year, 150th anniversary of the Continental Railroad. This is when they had spent so many decades now opening up the West, as Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. But now the West was moving even further west because the country was united by an intercontinental railroad. So I'm going to wind this up with another few words from our folks from the 19th century. And this one comes from the Railroad Guide. It's published by the Ohio State Journal Company, talking about railroads in Ohio in general. And it's kind of entertaining and in that 19th century sort of way. And traveler, whoever thou art, stop one moment to contemplate the progress and grandeur of this Western Empire. In Europe, Asia, and Africa, you will be called to admire ancient castles, ruined temples, fallen columns, and all evidences of a magnificence which is already either old or fallen to decay. Now look around you. Mark what you see. The past is gone. The present lives before you. This new empire is not falling, but rising to glory and grandeur. There rolls the Ohio, graceful in its curves, surrounded by green hills, but crowned with no ancient castles. Whence came this magic creation? Is it due to the sacrifice of blood, to the conquests of a great hero, to the government of an illustrious monarch? In truth, all that you see in this valley of the Ohio is a result of only a half-century of hard work. It is a plain term, but it expresses the whole. The railroads in the valleys of the Ohio did not exist 12 years ago, but now they are here to take you on your journey with all the speed, comfort, and convenience of any such road in any country. Where it once took weeks to accomplish a journey, it now takes only hours. What a revolution. But the revolution is not in the gain of time only or even money. The great change is in society. Thousands meet now where tens could only meet 20 years since. Look through these cars and you see around men, women, and children going to see friends or transact business or seeking pleasure where they would not have even dreamed of going a few years since. Some are only going to the next town. some to the lakes, some to the Atlantic, and some to Europe, and some, perhaps, will even wander through old Jerusalem before they will return again. The railroad has made man almost ubiquitous on this little earth, and his fondness for novelty and change is gratified beyond the dreams of fancy. Where will this stop? Nowhere. Nowhere till this earth is inhabited by one family, dwelling together in peace and unity.
All right. Super.
And listening to this story, and if you like this story, there's a part 2, or if in fact you want to give me a second chance because there's one. Anyway, coming up next month, Tuesday, April 7th, 10 o'clock, the next appearance before the Continuing Learning Program at dear old MUC. Okay, I know it's University of Miami, but it's my Union College. Anyway, Newbold Room at the Campus Center, Tuesday the 7th. Crossroads of the Standard Railroad of the World, which is the Pennsylvania Railroad. And so we'll talk about the golden age of railroads through the 19th century and the early 20th century. It's also the golden age of Alliance, Ohio. And it's a great story, too. So I appreciate your time, your patience, your attendance. And if you have any questions, we'd be glad to take them. But thank you.